On a cold January morning in 1986, millions of Americans watched as the Space Shuttle Challenger soared into the sky, then shattered just 73 seconds after launch, leaving the fate of its 7 crew members in question. Families, classrooms, and the entire nation were left not only grieving, but desperate to know what really became of those aboard Challenger. As shock turned to curiosity, haunting evidence soon emerged. Some of those details were never widely shared, and questions about the crew's final moments still linger decades later. To understand why the aftermath of this disaster shook America so deeply, we have to go back to that pivotal day and the extraordinary search that followed. Excitement buzzed through classrooms and living rooms across the United States as the countdown to Challenger's launch reached its final moments. On January 28, 1986, the promise of seeing a teacher become an astronaut turned a routine shuttle mission into a national event. Christa McAuliffe, a social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, had captured the imagination of millions. For the first time, a civilian educator was joining a NASA crew, and students coast to coast gathered in front of televisions to witness history. Schools rearranged schedules, wheeled carts of televisions into gymnasiums, and teachers led lessons about space exploration, all centered on this single morning. Major news networks broadcast live from Cape Canaveral, their anchors narrating every step as the shuttle stood on the launch pad. NASA's Teacher in Space project had generated an unprecedented level of engagement, with estimates suggesting that thousands of schools participated in the live viewing. The launch was scheduled for just before noon on the East Coast, timed so that classrooms from Maine to California could tune in. In some districts, entire student bodies gathered together, their eyes fixed on the screen, waiting for the moment when Christa McAuliffe would wave from inside the orbiter. The 7 Challenger crew members became symbols of hope and possibility, their faces familiar to children and adults alike. As the shuttle engines ignited and Challenger lifted off, cheers and applause filled the air. For a brief, shining moment, the country was united in anticipation, watching a vision of the future rise into the clear Florida sky. 73 seconds after launch, Challenger vanished in a cloud of smoke and flame, but the story did not end with the explosion. The crew compartment, battered but largely intact, separated from the rest of the shuttle and began its silent fall from 46,000 feet. For the next 2 minutes and 45 seconds, the cabin plunged toward the Atlantic. During that interval, the fate of the 7 astronauts remained uncertain, both to the world watching and perhaps to the crew themselves. Flight telemetry recorded the descent in stark intervals. There was no parachute, no means of slowing the fall. Inside the sealed compartment, the astronauts were strapped into their seats, surrounded by the remains of their shattered spacecraft. The question that would haunt investigators and families alike was simple. Did anyone remain aware during those final moments? Evidence later revealed that at least 3 personal egress air packs had been manually activated. Cockpit switches showed signs of being moved by hand, not by the force of the breakup. These details suggest that at least some members of the crew may have acted, possibly even hoped, during the long descent. The cabin's rapid loss of pressure threatened to render everyone unconscious within seconds. Yet the precise timeline, whether hypoxia claimed them early or consciousness flickered until impact, remained impossible to confirm. What is certain is the duration, 2 minutes and 45 seconds from breakup to ocean surface. In that span, the Challenger crew experienced a fall that remains one of the most chilling mysteries in the history of spaceflight. In the hours before Challenger's scheduled launch, a storm of concern swept through engineering offices at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. The forecast predicted temperatures as low as 36 degrees Fahrenheit at Cape Canaveral, far colder than any previous shuttle flight. Roger Boisjoli, a senior engineer who had spent months studying the O-ring seals, knew what that meant. The rubber O-rings, vital for preventing hot gases from escaping the rocket joints, lost flexibility in cold weather. Boisjoli had warned his managers that low temperatures could cause the seals to fail, leading to catastrophic consequences. On the evening of January 27, 1986, a tense teleconference connected Thiokol engineers in Utah with NASA officials in Florida. Alan McDonald, Thiokol's director of the Solid Rocket Motor Project, echoed Boisjoli's warnings. Both men argued that the shuttle should not launch under such conditions. The data was clear. The O-rings had never been tested below 53 degrees, and previous missions had shown signs of erosion even at higher temperatures. Boisjoli and McDonald insisted that the risk was unacceptable. As the call dragged on, pressure mounted. NASA managers questioned the evidence and pressed for a launch, citing tight schedules and the high-profile presence of Christa McAuliffe. In the end, Thiokol executives overruled their own engineers. The company's vice president, Jerry Mason, told the engineering team to take off their engineering hat and put on their management hat. Against their strongest objections, the final recommendation was changed and launch was approved. Boisjoli and McDonnell left the meeting deeply shaken. Both would later testify that the decision was made despite clear warnings and technical evidence. As dawn broke over Cape Canaveral, the shuttle stood ready on the pad, its fate sealed by a decision made in a conference room hundreds of miles away. At launch, Challenger's twin solid rocket boosters ignited alongside the shuttle's main engines, propelling the vehicle skyward. Seconds ticked by as the shuttle arced over the Atlantic. Inside the right booster, a thin gray line of flame began to snake outward from a joint near the base. The cold had stiffened the O-ring seals, leaving a tiny gap. Superheated gases reaching thousands of degrees burned through the compromised seal and escaped with growing force. The flame cut a path directly toward the massive external fuel tank, invisible to the naked eye, but captured in frame-by-frame analysis later. At 58 seconds, a plume of fire burst from the right booster joint. The escaping jet struck the external tank, weakening its structure. Mission control voices, calm but tense, continued to call out altitude and speed as telemetry streamed in. No one on the ground could see the fatal breach unfolding in real time. The shuttle climbed higher, passing through 46,000 feet. Then at exactly 73 seconds after launch, the external tank ruptured. Liquid hydrogen and oxygen mixed in an explosive cloud, tearing Challenger apart in an instant. The orbiter broke into pieces, its engines still firing as sections spiraled away from the blast. Fragments of the shuttle and both solid rocket boosters scattered across the sky. The boosters, still burning, spun wildly out of control before being remotely destroyed by range safety officers. Debris rained down over a vast stretch of ocean, marking the end of the flight and the beginning of a new crisis. The crew compartment, battered but still intact, separated from the wreckage and began its long, silent fall. In less than a minute and a half, a single flaw had brought down one of the most advanced machines ever built, setting in motion a recovery effort unlike any before. Recovery teams faced a staggering challenge as they launched the search for Challenger's wreckage. The explosion had scattered debris over an area of more than 486 square nautical miles in the Atlantic, stretching the limits of what even the most experienced naval crews had attempted. Navy grid maps divided the ocean into precise sectors, each one systematically combed by ships, helicopters, and aircraft. The operation brought together a fleet of vessels, including USS Preserver, Freedom Star, and the Liberty Star, along with Coast Guard cutters and support boats. Dozens of Navy divers rotated through 12-hour shifts, working in cold, murky water at depths of 100 to 200 feet. They relied on sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and underwater cameras to locate and identify shuttle fragments. Sailors and Coast Guard personnel coordinated surface sweeps, retrieving floating debris, and cataloging each piece for the accident investigation. The search was relentless, with teams braving strong currents, unpredictable weather, and the constant risk of entanglement among twisted metal and cables. Every find was logged and mapped, then relayed back to a central command post. The search grid grew tighter as more wreckage was recovered, with the goal of zeroing in on the crew compartment. Over the following weeks, 167 major pieces of Challenger were retrieved, nearly half the orbiter, along with sections of the external tank and both solid rocket boosters. The scale and complexity of the operation reflected not only the technical demands, but also the determination to account for every possible trace of the lost crew. Technical teams began their examination of the recovered crew compartment with a focus on every detail that might explain the astronauts' final moments. Among the most telling discoveries were personal egress air packs. These were emergency oxygen devices designed for use only in a dire situation. Of the 4 PEAPS recovered from the wreckage, 3 had been manually activated. This detail stood out to analysts. The PEAPS were not connected to the shuttle's main life support, and instead provided a limited supply of breathable air meant to be used if the cabin filled with smoke or lost pressure. Activation required a conscious, deliberate action, pulling a ring or flipping a switch attached to the harness. The fact that 3 had been switched on suggested that at least some crew members responded to the crisis after the breakup. Investigators also studied the positions of cockpit switches and circuit breakers. Several were found in settings that could only have been reached by hand, not by the force of the explosion or the fall. Switches on pilot Michael Smith's panel had been moved from their launch positions, indicating attempts to restore power or manage the shuttle's systems during the descent. These findings led engineers and medical experts to conclude that, for a brief window, some crew members were alert enough to act. The evidence did not answer every question about consciousness or survival, but it did reveal a final human effort to regain control in the face of catastrophe. These small but significant actions became central to understanding the tragedy, not just as a technical failure, but as a story of people who kept fighting until the very end. Remains from the Challenger crew compartment arrived at Patrick Air Force Base under heavy guard, shielded from public view and press speculation. For the identification process, forensic pathologists from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology began their work in a secure wing of the base hospital, relying on dental records, DNA analysis, and other advanced techniques to identify each astronaut. The process was painstaking. 6 weeks of submersion in salt water had left the remains fragmented and altered, complicating efforts to match them to individuals. Family members waited in private rooms nearby, leaning on NASA liaisons and grief counselors as each piece of news arrived. Dr. Joseph Kerwin, a former astronaut and chief medical examiner for the investigation, led the team. His official report confirmed that despite exhaustive examination, the exact cause of death for each crew member could not be determined. The violence of the ocean impact and the effects of prolonged submersion erased any clear evidence. Forensic teams worked with quiet urgency, determined to return whatever dignity they could to the fallen crew. Where possible, families chose private burials or cremations according to personal wishes. Christa McAuliffe was laid to rest in Concord, New Hampshire. Judith Resnik's ashes were scattered over the water. Gregory Jarvis's family held a ceremony by the Pacific Ocean. For remains that could not be individually identified or were mixed together, NASA arranged a collective interment at Arlington National Cemetery. On May 20th, 1986, a simple headstone in Section 46, grave 1129, became the final resting place for the Challenger crew's unidentified remains. It became a place of remembrance where families, colleagues, and the public could pay their respects in solemn remembrance. NASA's first response after the Challenger disaster was to halt all shuttle flights and launch a sweeping investigation. The Rogers Commission, led by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers, examined every layer of decision-making and technical oversight. Their findings exposed not just the O-ring failure, but deep flaws in a NASA's safety culture and communication. That report forced a new focus on accountability. In the months that followed, agency leaders faced hard choices. Engineers who had been sidelined now took center stage, and new protocols were written to give technical experts the authority to stop a launch if they saw danger. NASA established an Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance, placing safety as the top priority for every mission. Management structures were overhauled, and outside contractors like Morton Thiokol were required to report concerns directly to top NASA officials. The shuttle fleet itself underwent redesigns, and solid rocket boosters received a third O-ring. Heaters were added to protect against cold, and launch criteria became far more stringent. To replace Challenger, NASA built a new orbiter named Endeavour. Its first flight, STS-49, lifted off in May 1992 carrying a new generation of astronauts and the weight of the lessons learned. Endeavour's launch was more than a return to flight. It was a public demonstration that the agency had rebuilt trust in its machines and in its decision-making. These reforms laid the groundwork for a renewed commitment to safety and accountability, shaping every shuttle mission that followed. June Scobee Rogers, the widow of Challenger Commander Dick Scobee, refused to let the memory of the crew fade into tragedy. In the months after the disaster, she and other families gathered in living rooms and church halls, searching for a way to honor their loved ones beyond a memorial stone. Their answer was action, a living tribute that would carry Challenger's spirit into classrooms for generations. The Challenger Center for Space Science Education opened its doors in 1986, just months after the accident. Its mission was to ignite curiosity in students and turn loss into inspiration. Today, more than 40 Challenger Learning Centers operate across the United States and abroad, reaching hundreds of thousands of students each year. Children who never saw the launch or felt the shock of that January morning now sit at mission control simulators, running experiments and solving problems as if they themselves were astronauts. The Challenger story continues to echo in unexpected ways. In 2022, a documentary crew searching off the Florida coast discovered a 20-foot section of the shuttle's wreckage, still resting on the ocean floor after more than 3 decades. The find renewed public interest and reminded the world that pieces of Challenger remain, both physically and in the collective memory. For the families, for educators, and for students, the Challenger legacy is not just about loss. It is about the choice to build something lasting from grief, to turn sorrow into discovery, and to keep reaching for the stars. Today, every mission launches with protocols shaped by the Challenger tragedy, right down to how we honor human life lost in pursuit of the unknown. As commercial spaceflight accelerates, the questions of risk, responsibility, and remembrance grow only more urgent. What we choose to remember and how we choose to honor continues to define the boundaries of exploration. Share your thoughts below.